they, I would definitely go back and talk about the African kingdoms, not only in West Africa, but those that existed in Central Africa, Southern Africa, and surely those that existed in Northeastern Africa. But this is a situation where we only have a few minutes to talk about the development of the colonies, but I do want to at least mention this bit of information. Many of you probably have already heard of the colonies, the kingdoms of Ghana, Mali, and Songhai that were at an apex between 1000 and about 1591 AD. This is a map of essentially where those kingdoms were, starting here on the coast, all the way across Ghana, Mali, Songhai. Today, it would be, the United States would represent the size of what Ghana, Mali, and Songhai were at Songhai's peak in about 1591. I'll go through this hurriedly. We can't really begin to talk about American history without looking at this convergence of red, black, and white that I talk about. At what point do Black folks and red people and white people actually come together based on what we know now? Many of you probably have heard of Prince Henry the Navigator, who was responsible for establishing the Institute of Oceanic Studies in 1420 in Lisbon, Portugal. The reason the African part of this is so important is because of the trade that existed between Africans and the Muslims beginning around 715 AD and lasting all the way down until about the early 1500s. Well, Europeans were left out of that trade, but they heard about the trade between the Africans and the Muslims who were coming across the Sahara Desert, known as the Trans-Saharan slave trade or the Trans-Saharan trade. So there's a connection between the beginnings of the Atlantic trade, the Atlantic slave trade, and the Trans-Saharan trade, in that the Europeans knew about this trade between Africans and Muslims and wanted to get in on it. They heard of the legend of Prester John, who would translated would be Priest John. Prester John was this Christian, this legendary Christian who presided over this huge Christian kingdom. And what was so important about this kingdom was the fact that it was filled with gold and other riches. At least that's what Europeans had heard. And essentially what they're hearing about is this trade between the Africans and the Muslims that involved gold, human beings, salt, cowrie shells, and they wanted in on this. And so when Prince Henry established his School of Oceanic Studies in 1420, he was about the business of trying to find Prester John and this huge kingdom of gold and other riches. So he begins to explore the northwestern corners of Africa, and he either rediscovered or discovered the Azores and Madeira and other islands just off the coast of Africa. And this would be the area that we're talking about, the Canary Islands, Madeira, Cape Verde. He had actually sent his men, he didn't go himself, sent his men to actually discover these areas. By 1441, it actually made his way on down the West African coast and actually had come into contact with groups of people in an area that we now call Mauritania. The two individuals who led these initial expeditions in 1441 were Nuno Tristão and Anton Gonçalves. And they, in essence, were looking for the kingdom of Prester John. But Europeans, the Portuguese in this case, they were ethnocentric. They believed that everything, for the most part, revolved around them. They believed that their culture was the best, their religion was the best. And as a part of Tristeo's and Gonzalez's dictate was to actually catechize or convert, quote, heathens and pagans with whom they came in contact. You assume that anybody who is not a Christian, of course, is a heathen or a pagan. And so as a part of your mandate, as a part of your duty to, when you came into contact with these people, was to actually catechize or convert them to Christianity. When they landed in Mauritania, specifically in the area that is referred to as Cape Blanc, they came into contact with various groups of people, including Muslims. They decided not to establish friendly relationships with people with whom they came in contact, and they began to kind of round people up. They kidnapped individuals and eventually carried them back to Lisbon in 1441. Prince Henry the Navigator was happy. King Alfonso was happy. And they decided that they would make other trips along the West African coast. Well, over the next few years, hundreds of Africans were taken back to Portugal and used as servants and slaves. And King Alfonso and Prince Henry received 20% of all the Africans who were coming in to use them exactly the way they wanted to use them. How did they actually acquire these individuals along the West African coast? They kidnapped them. They were involved in what was referred to as pannuring, and eventually an organized system of trade developed by 1450. So human beings were traded for textiles, guns and ammunition, alcohol, ivory, and many other goods. But about 78% of all the goods that were traded for human beings in these early days between the Portuguese and the various West African ethnic groups, believe it or not, it was textile. So by 1450, what started out as kidnapping and pandering as a chief means of acquisition became an organized system of trade. So if we had to put a date on the beginning of the organized slave trade between various West African ethnic groups and the Portuguese, it would be about 1450. Prince Henry, who got this thing started in 1420, died in 1460. But by the time of his death, the Portuguese had already established a rhythm of trade and connections to various ethnic groups, actually coming from deep in the interior, from the interior of Africa. By 1482, many of you may know that they had already made their way down to the Gold Coast, referred to as Ghana. Fort Elmina was under construction as early as 1482. Luanda and Benguela, an area that we call Angola today, had been visited. Africans were leaving that area, going back to Portugal. And by 1488, Bartholomew Diaz had actually made his way to the Cape of Good Hope, around the southern tip of the African continent. And this map, if you look at my pointer here, is where the first group of Africans were taken. And by 1488, the Portuguese had made their way, coming into contact with various West African groups all the way down to the southern tip of Africa. So they had made their way in, they were solidified. 1493, they were in the Congo. Baptisms were occurring. There was a kind of diplomatic trade between West Africans in the Congo and the Portuguese. The children of the kings and chiefs were actually sent back to Lisbon to go to school. And so there was this exchange between the Portuguese and the people of the Congo, and more than just the trade in human beings. You know, when we look at the Portuguese in Africa, they were there from the 1440s all the way down to the 1980s, from extracting millions of human beings and bringing them to the New World, hiring the Spaniards to bring Africans to the New World. And then by the 1870s, 1880s, they have begun to colonize the folks. So Kwame Nkrumah said that Europeans made 2 attacks upon the African continent. They took Africans from Africa, and then they took Africa from the Africans. And of course, he's talking about colonialism and neocolonialism that began in the 1870s. So the Portuguese, the most powerful nation actually in Europe at this time. You know, if you look at Portugal here and you come all the way around, it actually made their way into India by 1500. So Spain is looking at what is happening, and they want a piece of the action. So it's at this point that they make a contract with this young fellow by the name of Christopher Columbus, and they sign an agreement called the Privileges and Prerogatives granted by their Catholic Majesties to Christopher Columbus in 1492. Now, at some point in time, we don't have time to do it today, but at some point in time, I want you to take down this Privileges and Prerogatives. I want you to actually go to the Avalon Project, Documents in Law, History, and Diplomacy, and you need to read that document, because many other nations will follow suit and draw up these documents, making a claim to various places in what they would eventually call the New World. So read that document. It makes it clear why Christopher Columbus is making a journey somewhere. Didn't really know where he was going, but he's making this journey in search of India. Of course, when he comes into contact with people in the Americas, he referred to them as Indians because he thought he had actually made it to the area that he thought he was going. He believed that if he would set sail for about 4,000 to 6,000 miles, he would come into contact with the people of that area. But he came into land that eventually would be called the Americas. So when Columbus made his journey to what we now call the New World, obviously there was this belief by the Pope of the Catholic Church, Alexander VI, that there could be this confrontation between these 2 Catholic nations. And so to avoid war, in 1493, Pope Alexander VI drew up what is called the Papal Bull of Demarcation. And what this Papal Bull of Demarcation did was to divide the world between Spain and Portugal without asking anybody in those areas, be it Africa or the Native American, the indigenous population in the Americas, any questions at all about, is it okay? And this papal bull of demarcation was followed about a year later with the Treaty of Tordesillas. We'll see on the map in a few minutes exactly how that, where that line was around the globe. So the Treaty of Tordesillas was drawn up in June of 1494 to pretty much put a stamp of approval on what the Pope had done back in 1493. And this map is the papal bull of demarcation. It's actually this first dotted line here. And everything on this side of the line belonged to Portugal. And the Spaniards could not go into the Portuguese territory without permission from the Portuguese. Everything on this side of the line, the dotted line, belonged to Spain. And the same applied. Portugal could not venture into this territory without permission from the Spaniards. The 1494 Treaty of Tordesillas, however, in that document, after investigations were done, it was found that the line had actually cut off a huge portion of what was actually a part of the Spanish territory. And so this line was actually carried a few degrees west. And now everything on this side of the line belonged to Portugal. Everything over here. So the bottom line is Portugal now has territory in the New World. The first line only gave them just a little bit, but this new line actually gave them an area that eventually they called Brazil. And what's so significant about that is the fact that they are now able to bring human beings into that newly acquired territory. As a matter of fact, 38% of all the Africans who came into the New World, and we're talking 14 to 15 million, 38% of them landed in Brazil during that 300-year cycle of the slave trade. So it was important that Portugal received this territory here. All right. So by the time we get to 1500, both Portugal and Spain pretty much have begun to settle into their respective areas. We know that the Spaniards agreed that they were not going to do the work, that they would allow the indigenous population to do all of that. However, after a few years, it was recognized that the Native American population was dying out. They succumbed to the various diseases that were being brought over. And so by 1517, Bishop Bartholomew de las Casas decided that he had seen enough, and he wrote this letter to the King of Spain suggesting that Native Americans no longer be used as the primary labor force in the Spanish colonies, and that Africans who did not succumb to the diseases as readily as the indigenous population actually be used as the basic labor force in the colonies. The king agreed with that, the Pope agreed with that, and essentially the next year, the Asiento was drawn up between Spain and Portugal. And what that Asiento did was to now allow the Portuguese to bring all of those Africans that they've been acquiring since the 1440s, to now bring them over to the Spanish colonies for sale. We're going to bring them to the Portuguese colonies, but we're also going to take them into the Spanish colonies for sale. So whichever nation had the asiento was the power nation. And we know that Portugal had that for many, many years. 1672, England received the asiento. And to a great extent, that explains why so many Africans eventually would be brought into the English colonies. So in 1518, what we know of as the transatlantic slave trade is on. Before 1518, it was for the most part the Atlantic slave trade. That is the trade between the various West African ethnic groups and the Portuguese. And these Africans were going into Portugal and into Spain. They were being traded as far north as the English colonies. So people across Europe were familiar with the fact that the Portuguese were going into Africa and extracting a population who would be enslaved or used as servants. England is sitting back looking at what is going on, and they want a piece of the action too. So this brings us to the English efforts to establish colonies somewhere in the New World. Now remember that the Treaty of Tordesillas, the Papal Bull of Demarcation are in effect. So no other European nations are actually supposed to come into the Portuguese or the Spanish territories. And we know that eventually warfare resulted as a result of attempts by the English, but they persisted. And in 1559, of course, Queen Elizabeth ascends to the throne. And by the 1560s, she has these ideas of expanding the English domain. And as it turns out, in 1583, she issued this charter to Sir Humphrey Gilbert. And she authorizes him to go to the northernmost part of the Americas. She didn't send him directly down into the fray, down into the Caribbean or into what we now call North America or the Central America or South America, because she wanted to avoid warfare. And she created, this, here again, you can go to the Avalon Project and look at the charter that she issued to Sir Humphrey Gilbert, so that she would, it's actually constructed or written in such a way that it's not the power of England that's doing this, but Sir Humphrey Gilbert is doing this, so that warfare would not come about between these two nations. So Sir Humphrey Gilbert makes his way into an area called Newfound Land, or Newfoundland. The problem, of course, is that on his way back, one of the ships went down. He was on that ship, so he didn't survive. But those who came back, obviously, are telling the Queen that, hey, we still want to plant a colony somewhere in the New World. And so it is Sir Humphrey Gilbert's half-brother, Sir Walter Raleigh, in 1584, who sends, he didn't come himself, the Queen would not allow him to come, but she sends him over with, he sends at least, she authorized, using the same charter that had been issued to his half-brother, he sends a group of soldiers over in 1584, and they come into an area. When they left England, they were told to go into an area that would later be called Jamestown. However, because of weather conditions, they found themselves south of that in an area that we know today as the Outer Banks. So they are there for a while. Things didn't work out like they wanted. However, they did build a little fort there. And eventually, they send over another expedition in 1585. And this one, of course, consisted of men, women, and children. The problem was that they had conflicts with the Native American population. They did not know how to grow crops. So many of them actually died. And that resulted in what we know of as the Lost Colony. Research is still being done to find out what happened to those individuals. There are a number of theories. One theory is that the Spaniards came in and killed them. Another theory is that the Spaniards actually came across the Appalachian Mountains all the way across what we know of now as North Carolina and wiped out the settlement. One theory is that they moved into an area down in what we now call Robeson County. Those Native Americans who live in that area, some of them maintain that indeed they are the descendants of the lost colony. Another theory holds that some of them actually made their way to the area of Jamestown, even before Jamestown was established, because that is where they were supposed to have gone initially in 1584. Native Americans living in the area of Jamestown indicated to white men who came in 1608, 1609, that they had actually seen white men before. And the likelihood is that those white men they saw before may have come from Sir Walter Raleigh's Outer Banks colony, Manteo. Because there was this failure with the so-called lost colony, there were no real efforts by the crown, the English crown, to establish colonies. The human cost, they believed, was too high. In addition to that, the cost in general to actually send expeditions over were they deemed to be too expensive. In 1603, King James I ascends to the throne, and he has an interest in establishing colonies again somewhere in the New World. And this time, he authorized the establishment of joint stock companies where people would actually invest. The idea was to get thousands and thousands of people to invest small amounts of money as compared to a few people investing tremendous amounts of money. And so two of these joint stock companies were established. The Virginia Company of Plymouth was authorized to establish a colony somewhere in the northern part of Virginia. Now, what we know of as the United States was actually claimed by England as early as the 1580s, and they christened the whole area Virginia. So the northern part of Virginia, an area that would be called Massachusetts today, would be actually colonized by the Virginia Company of Plymouth. The Virginia Company of London was given the authority to establish a colony somewhere in the southern part of Virginia. And that would be today Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Florida, Georgia, and so forth. The Virginia Company of Plymouth in 1606 made an attempt to establish a colony in the northern part. Didn't work out for them. However, the Virginia Company of Plymouth sent 144 men and boys in December of 1606. They reached the area that they were supposed to have reached back in 1584, and what we now call the Jamestown area. They went into that area. They went up what was they called the James River and established Jamestown in 1607. It was rough going. As a matter of fact, between 1607 and 1625, 80% of the people who came to the Jamestown colony actually perished. The winter of 1609, 1610, we may have heard the fact that people resorted to cannibalism in order to survive. But by 1617, after experimenting with tobacco, they're actually able to send back about 20,000 pounds of tobacco. And that was a real reason for coming here. You know, people talk about, you know, this nation was established on the foundation of religion and this and that. It was established on the foundation of making some money. That's what it was all about. The Virginia company was a joint stock company where people invested, and they're looking to reap the benefits of their investment. So when tobacco is actually sent back to England and it is processed, then people are reaping a little bit. So the foundation upon which the nation is actually built, the premise upon which it was built, is economics. And all the other stuff that we talk about comes in later. So what about the arrival of Africans? Most of the people who were coming into Jamestown between 1607 and 1619 were coming as indentured servants. Many of you probably know those first Africans. They came aboard a Dutch ship that had been actually, they were taken from a vessel, Portuguese vessel. They raided that vessel as they normally did. And the Dutch at this time had more ships than any other nation in Europe. They were the powerhouse nation in Europe. They did a lot of transporting of goods for the Portuguese, for the English, for the Spaniards. They had the largest fleet of ships than any other nation in Europe. And so those 20 Africans who came into Jamestown in 1619 came aboard a Dutch ship. And the question is, you know, what do we do with these folks? Well, we do the same thing that we would do with whites who had been kidnapped. We sell them, and it is up to the people who purchased them to do what they want to do with them. And so the big question that we have all in the literature from the 1950s down to the present time is, were these 20 Blacks used as indentured servants, or were they automatically enslaved? I think most scholars today, you can pick up any textbook, and most of the scholars who've written about this period would go along with Oscar and Mary Hanlon, who back in the 1950s believed that they came in as indentured servants, and they were used as indentured servants as others were used, and that in essence, slavery evolved out of that. If you believe Carl Degler maintained that the English were racists. They knew about the fact that slavery existed in Spanish and Portuguese colonies. They were familiar with it for 100 years, and that essentially they used those first Africans as slaves. Oscar Mary Hanlon would actually argue that the word slave is never used in any of the documents of the 1620s. But we do know that by the 1630s, the phrase Negro slave is being used. And Some of you may be familiar with the John Punch incident of 1640. John Punch was a Black man. He ran away with 2 white indentured servants. They were captured. The 2 white indentured servants had extended terms added to an extended term added to their terms of indenture. And in Virginia, I think it was 6 months added if you ran away. And so that happened in their case. But when the judge referenced John Punch, he told him that he would have to serve his masters for the remainder of his natural life. And the big question is, why would he point to this Black man and enslave him for the remainder of his life and give an extended term to the white indentured servants? And that was 1640. Now, that was not a law passed by Virginia. They didn't legalize slavery at this point. This is an order of one judge. But that judge obviously was familiar with the fact that Black people were being enslaved by this time. The colonial population in 1650 was about 50,000, of whom about 1,000 were Black. By the time we get to 1700, there are 260,000 colonists, and of those, about 28,000 are Black. By 1750, that number has swollen to 1.5 million, of whom 156,000 were Black. And on the eve of the American Revolution, there were 2.1 million people in colonial America, and 500,000 of those individuals were Black. One question may be, well, how many free Blacks were there at the time? It's more difficult to put our hands on that because Maryland became the first colony to actually enumerate its free Black population. And that doesn't come really until the 1780s. We do know that in 1790, when the first decennial census was taken, that's the point at which we are now the United States of America. We know that there were 757,000 Blacks, of whom about 60,000 were free. And over the years, of course, those numbers. So 1790, we're looking at about 60,000 Blacks. About 5,000 of those free Blacks lived right here in North Carolina. Virginia, Maryland actually, until the 1860s, always had the largest number of free Blacks, followed by Virginia. So when does the legalization of slavery actually occur in colonial America? Believe it or not, Massachusetts, not a Southern colony, was the first one to actually establish slavery. And the way they framed it was that a Christian may not actually enslave another Christian. A person who would be enslaved would be different than the enslaver in terms of religion, in terms of color, in terms of ethnicity. Nevertheless, Massachusetts becomes that first colony to actually establish slavery. Virginia followed in 1660, Maryland 1661, Carolina 1663, and North Carolina has actually 3 documents where they actually legalize what they called Negro slavery, 1663 with the original charter, and then another charter in 1665, and then under what was called Locke's Grand Old Model in 1669. Now, one question that was asked by whites in Virginia, those who were anti-slavers at that time, was whether or not you would enslave a Black person who had become a Christian. And in Virginia and the other colonies actually answered that pretty quickly. Virginia actually denounced the right of Blacks to religious protection from enslavement very early. Now, let me give you an idea. I can't see some of this, but this is the actual reading. Let's see if I can. Whereas some doubts have arisen whether children got by any Englishman upon a Negro woman should be slave or free. Be it therefore enacted and declared by this present Grand Assembly that all children born in this country shall be held bond or free only according to the condition of the mother, and that if any Christian shall commit fornication with a Negro man or woman, he or she so offending shall pay double the fines imposed by the former act. And this next act of 1667 says, it is enacted and declared by this Grand Assembly and the authority thereof, that the conferring of baptism doeth not alter the condition of the person as to his bondage or freedom. That diverse masters, freed from this doubt, may more carefully endeavor the propagation of Christianity by permitting children, those slaves, or those of greater growth, and capable to be admitted to that sacrament. So it didn't make any difference if you were a Christian or not. That did not in any way mitigate your enslavement. These are some other laws that were passed, and one of the important things about, significant things about looking at the laws, especially these early laws, is that they are based to a great extent in Roman and Grecian law, and they become the basis of laws passed in terms of sentiment all the way down through the Black codes that were passed in the 1860s by the Southern states, all the way down to laws passed affecting Black folk down to 1964. So it's important to go back and look at the various slave codes. And if you look at England's slave code, Virginia's slave code, it becomes the basis for North Carolina's code that was established in 1715. It becomes the basis for Maryland's code, even for the code passed in Massachusetts. All of these states, all 13 of the colonies, 12 of the colonies, legalized the enslavement of people of African descent to some extent. So this one passed in 1691, whereas many times Negroes, mulattoes, and other slaves unlawfully absent themselves from their masters' and mistresses' service and lie hid and lurk in obscure places, killing hogs and committing other injuries to the inhabitants of this dominion. It is hereby enacted in case any of the aforesaid shall resist, run away, or refuse to deliver and surrender him or themselves, it shall and may be lawful for any person or persons authorized to recover runaways to kill and destroy such Negroes, mulattoes, and other slave or slaves by gun or any otherwise whatsoever. So this 1691 law in Virginia becomes the basic wording for the laws passed in the other colonies with regard to runaway slaves. Now, anybody can kill a runaway slave. North Carolina solidified its law in 1741 by absolutely paying someone to capture a runaway slave, to actually kill a runaway slave. And not only that, the owner could actually give you permission to kill his runaway slave. And the state actually had a fund, or the colony had a fund, the county had a fund which paid you 2/3 the value of the enslaved person for killing him or her. When you talk about the American Revolution, actually the genesis of the American Revolution, I believe, was set in 1651 when England passed its very first Navigation Act. And it followed with acts in 1660, 1663, 1673, 1693, declared that only English ships would be allowed to bring goods into England, and that the North American colonies could only export its commodities, such as tobacco and sugar, to England. With the passage of each Navigation Act, the commercial relationship was strengthened between the colonies and the mother country. They dictated who could trade with England, the specific products that could be shipped, how many people of English descent could be on a ship. For example, by 1673, they're at 1693, they're saying that 75% of the people on a vessel that came into England actually had to have, 75% of them had to be of English ancestry. The Plantation Duty Act of 1673 really affected North Carolina, because what that tax did was to place a tax on tobacco. And even by 1673, the colony was only 10 years old. It had begun to experiment with tobacco, and it was sending hundreds and hundreds of pounds of tobacco to Massachusetts and Virginia. And so the Culpeper Rebellion was the result of this Plantation Duty Act of 1673. Navigation Acts, as all of you know, were passed in some form or another all the way down to the start of the American Revolution. So resistance to both the royal and the proprietary authority, not only led to Culpeper's Rebellion of 1673, but Bacon's Rebellion of 1676. To a great extent, it had to do with the profits of the so-called upper echelon against the poor folks, so-called poor folks in the colony. Not only that, it was believed that the powers to be in Virginia did not do enough to run the Native Americans out of Virginia. The Carolinians' resistance to the proprietors and royal authority, all the way down to the regulator movement between 1768 and 1771. It was actually a precursor to the American Revolution. If you want to understand the American Revolution, you got to look to North Carolina from the 1670s all the way down to this regulator movement that occurred in Orange County. Well, that would be Wake County today, but Orange County and Alamance County. North Carolina was always fighting the powers to be. Right today, as all of you know, the governor is not the most powerful individual in the state's government. It is the legislature. And that has been the case since the 1670s. Sometimes the colonists would not even allow the North Carolina governor to sit. They would run him out of the state, out of the colony. We know as early as 1748, there was no government in North Carolina between 1748 and 1753 at all. They were just pretty much operating, by the seat of his pants. And much of that had to do with the conflict between Eastern North Carolina, Carolinians and Western Carolinians. All of you are familiar with these acts, beginning with the Sugar Act of 1764, the Stamp Act of 1765. And here again, these are essentially navigation. They're part of the navigation package that began in 1751. The Townshend Acts that were passed in 1767, 1768, placing taxes on everything almost. All of you are familiar with the Boston Tea Party of 1773, and these coercive acts, as the British called them, but they were referred to as the intolerable acts by the colonists, including the Boston Port Act of March 1774, which in essence closed down the port, wouldn't allow anything to come in, nothing to leave until Massachusetts or the Boston folks there paid for the fact that they had dumped their tea in December of 1773. The Massachusetts Government Act, in essence, the British are saying that we control the government now. They've gone back and rescinded the 1691 charter issued to Massachusetts. The Administration of Justice Act essentially said that we will not allow you to try individuals who did anything that resulted in the death or the destruction of property of someone of British descent. The Quartering Act, I think most of us have heard of that, didn't necessarily mean that they would send British troops into the homes of individuals. It was centered more around using unoccupied buildings. And unfortunately for the British, many of those unoccupied buildings were in terrible shape. And the people in Massachusetts said, we're not going to spend one dime to actually resurrect or rehabilitate any of these old buildings. So the Quartering Act didn't work out too well for the British. And under the Quebec Act, lands that had actually been authorized for the colonists now were given to the people of Quebec. And so in essence, we've gone through a very quick encapsulated version of how the colonies actually came to be the colonies and eventually move into the American Revolution, how the colonies actually became the United States of America. I guess that is set aside for part two.
Yes, sir. That's greatly appreciated, Dr. Parker. I want everyone to kind of have a better understanding of our origin story in this exchange. This is the racial equity learning community, so there's opportunities to learn. This is not anything that is skewed one way or the other. It's an opportunity to introduce yourself to information that you may not be aware of in totality and in context. And context is the critical thing in the world of history. You need to understand why this begets that. And I hope that this presentation today by Dr. Parker gives you an idea of the origin of not just slavery, but the expansion of ideas and energies towards finding resources to undergird wealth in other places. And that's associated with how America comes to be. As we get closer to the Revolutionary War, which Dr. Parker will cover in the next presentation, you also begin to see, and you saw previews of it early on, the establishment and understanding of racial lines being drawn and it being completely and totally understood who was to be understood as laborers in that society, and that be their sole purpose of establishing this country and building. You guys have to really think back and understand the wilderness that this place was, and that we're not even remotely in the middle or the west at all. This is all about the East Coast. at this point. So if there's any questions, throw up a hand or just on mic and say something. Otherwise, we'll wind down and you can reserve comments and questions till we wrap up this series. We will have a break in between this series, and I'm hoping to bring in another colleague to talk about some things around the Civil War. So the second part, we'll get to and through the Revolutionary War, and then we'll get into the Civil War in the third part, which will probably be closer to May, June. So if there's any thoughts, questions, anything that anybody want to share, now's the time. Otherwise, okay, Ann?
Freddie, I did have a question. And Felton, I guess this is also probably for you too. Hello.
Hey, Annie, how you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
Doing great.
Good. Okay. So this is kind of about, I mean, this is obviously what you were talking about, but I was thinking about this while you were talking. And my question is, and I feel like this comes up a lot with the amount of, I guess, enslaved people that were brought to the Caribbean and South America versus the amount of enslaved people who were brought to North America. Was that because the Portuguese started, like, more people were, I guess, technically brought over to if you look at the numbers, there were more people who were brought to the Caribbean and South America. Is that because the Portuguese were doing it like a century before they started bringing people into North America? Does that make sense? Or was it because the agriculture and like climate of South America and the Caribbean was more suitable, and because people were dying faster?
Yeah. Well, they have a 100-year head start on North America, one. Number two, the English don't actually get involved until the 1670s when they actually get the Asiento. So the fact that they have a 100-year head start it explains most of that. The fact is that by the time we get to the 1670s and 1680s, most of the people who had come, a huge number of the people who had come to the Americas were already here. Because remember, they start in 1518. And by the time we get to 1540, the Spaniards, the Portuguese are bringing into the Spanish colonies an average of 15,000 enslaved people annually. That's by 1540. And they began to populate the Portuguese colony, that is Pernambuco and Bahia, in the 1530s and 40s. I think they concentrated mostly with the Spaniards in those early years, and then they began to people their own colony. They began to people their own colony. They began to people it. And the bottom line too is that when you look at where they were coming from in Africa, that is, Angola was nearly depopulated by the slave trade. At that time it was called Pernambuco. And I'm sorry, it was called Luanda and Benguela. And if you look at Brazil and its proximity to Angola, you can see that the distance is straight shot, and the distance is not that far. So as late as 1835, when Africans were still coming from Angola into Brazil, it only took 36 days.
Oh, wow. That is
only
way
36
fast.
days compared to bringing them from Angola to South Carolina, which took 3 months.
Yeah.
So proximity to Brazil, proximity to some of the other South American nations that would become nations, and into the Caribbean, that distance is much shorter, number one. And so the English, when they get the Asiento, they begin to bring people in. You may know that most of the Africans who came into colonial America they came in between about 1740 and 1790. And the slave trade was actually cut off between the English and the Americas in 1778. I'm sorry, 1774, when the non-exportation, non-importation, non-consumption agreement was passed in 1774. That in effect killed the slave trade between England and the colonists. I mean, people were smuggled in. And then when the Constitution was written in 1787, it put a 20-year limit on the number, a 20-year limit on the slave trade to the United States. So the slave trade, in effect, ends in 1808, but it didn't end in the South American and Caribbean nations until much later. So I think all of those factors pretty much explain the extent to why you have fewer Africans coming into British North America. We're only talking about, for some reason, I know when I was growing up, knowing that slavery existed in the United States, I believed that just millions and millions of Africans came to the United States, but only 500,000.
It's not nearly as many as people would think.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And for North Carolina, the number was probably only between 5,000 and 7,000.
Oh, wow.
We do know that South Carolina received 38% of all the Africans who came into the United States and colonial America, 38%. So the 62%, North Carolina, Virginia, Delaware, Maryland, and other places. And so the Africans who came into North Carolina, for the most part, were transshipped from Virginia, but definitely South Carolina. So geographical factors all play a part. Proximity to Africa play a part in those numbers.
Yeah, I think we'll get into some of the incubation that takes place as far as why the population of Black people in America is sustained and maintained, which solidifies that specificity that I often speak of in terms of Black Americanness that I actually spoke about yesterday with your group, Dr. Parker. You got a couple of comments in the chat. I think somebody else had a question that. So if I can get hands, that way I can call on you if you have a question, and we still have a good 18 minutes left on the timer for the Zoom. I have it set for 1:30. So if you got any questions with hands, please just show them and I'll recognize you. Ricky asks, have you traveled to these countries as part of your research, and did you have any challenges in obtaining the facts, Dr. Parker?
No, it's too expensive to go do research. Atlantic slave trade, I've been saying this for 40 years. Slave trade, if you're going to do research on the slave trade, you're going to write books on it. That's not my focus. Then you got to go there. You can't sit at home. You can't sit in the archives. You got to go to England. You got to go to France. You got to go to Portugal. You got to go to Spain. You definitely have to go to Ghana, to Mauritania. You have to. So it's expensive to do all of that. So people who have gone and done that, beginning, and especially in the 1960s, is when we had this profusion of books and articles on the slave trade. And surely by the 1970s, people have gotten all kinds of grants, and the institutions have been established for the explicit purpose of doing research in the slave trade. So no, I have not been to Africa to do any slave trade studies. I have not gone into Europe. The great thing about this digital world today is that we can sit at home now. 30 years ago, you couldn't. But today we can sit at home because so much of this has been digitized. And so the documents that I looked at 40 years ago in the archives, I can sit at home and look at now in a digitized version. I did a study on runaway slaves 35 years ago, and I had to go to all of the repositories to find the actual newspapers. Now the good people up at UNC and A&T have digitized all of the thousands of ads that I have in my book. I mean, I can go and manipulate that data in so many different ways today. So that's our digital world today. And I think, you know, if you don't get into that digital world, you'll still be riding that horse and buggy, and you're going to be left behind. I'd rather fly on that 757 any day in terms of doing research than to be trying to do it on a horse and buggy.
And that potential seasickness is real when the ship is rickety and rockety that have to take that long bit of travel across the ocean. And I echo Dr. Parker's sentiment in terms of research. I mean, my stuff is focused on America, and you still have to have funding. You still have to be able to eat and sleep comfortably when you go visit these places, especially to do meaningful work. So yeah, you got to be funded to do so. You have a compliment, Dr. Parker. That was an amazing, highly informative session. I learned so much I did not know. I really appreciate the pre-transatlantic slavery focus. Identifying the beginning of a thing is always critical when reflecting on history and moving forward. That was from Tango. And Ryan Clark says, thank you, Dr. Parker. He has to sign off, but he looks forward to the next chat.
Thank you.
Everyone, you know, take it all in and really, I put a couple of links to some of the things that were mentioned from Avalon to explore, but explore that site if you're curious. There's a whole lot there. And as Dr. Parker mentioned, you don't have to leave your home to do so. If you're interested, you can check it out. Dr. Parker, I'll give you final words before we get out of here.
Oh, always enjoy imparting information, always enjoy, you know, talking with people about this stuff. Because as I said from the outset, you know, we are absolutely under attack. I was in a session Monday evening with a group of teachers from Alamance County. And one of them actually said that she had been called to the office because she was trying to teach some basic African-American history. So teachers are absolutely afraid to teach, you know, truth, basic American history that may offend, you know, a 10-year-old child, and that child goes back and tells mom and daddy that they said this about Native Americans, and Native Americans were treated this way, and Africans were treated that way, and so forth, that women were treated this way. And so they are doing everything in their powers to not offend anyone by just teaching basic American history. And all of this is American history. We're talking African-American history, we're talking women's history, we're talking whatever it is. It is essentially one history. It's you know, it's so tragic that we have to compartmentalize the teaching of Native American history or women's history or African history because people don't see it as a part of American history. Okay, now we will have a look at Black history. Now we'll have a look at women's history, when all of this stuff is so inextricably tied together. But unfortunately, you know, this is the way we had to do it over the years.
The collective, guys, that's what we're trying to elevate in spaces like that. There's a collective history. And, you know, when I talk to the youth, it's not about feeling good or feeling bad. It's actually just about knowing. And when you know more and better, you should be willing to do more and better. So that's the overarching goal here. I'm so appreciative of you guys showing up. That was plenty of people here, and there'll be plenty more that this is shared with the RELC community and whoever else may come across it. Vanessa says, wonderful context. I agree that we must continue to tell this history. Amen. All hearts and minds are settled, as the church would say. I hope we are in a good headspace for a Thursday and ready for a relaxing weekend. And I hope you guys take some of this with you and actually expand upon it with people that you know in your personal life. This is not meant to just be a space you check in and out of, take it with you, and hopefully we make the world a better place. Everybody good to go? I will send this out very soon, and as I often do, I hit the record button late. I apologize for that, but there is enough to go off of here, so it'll be sent out before we meet again. And Dr. Parker, again, greatly appreciate you. Look forward to the next session.
All right, take care, everybody.
All right, you guys have a good one.